I have never been what you'd call a crying man. My ex-wife said that my non-existent emotional gradient was the main reason she was leaving me, as if the guy she met in her AA meetings was beside the point. Christy said she supposed she could forgive me, not crying at her father's funeral. I had only known him for 6 years and couldn't understand what a wonderful giving man he had been. A Mustang convertible as a high school graduation present, for instance. But then, when I didn't cry at my own parents' funerals, they died just 2 years apart. Dad of stomach cancer and Mom of a thunderclap heart attack while walking on a Florida beach. She began to understand the non-existent gradient thing. I was unable to feel my feelings, in AA speak. "I have never seen you shed tears," she said, speaking in the flat tones people use when they are expressing the absolute final deal-breaker in a relationship. "Even when you told me I had to go to rehab or you were leaving." This conversation happened about 6 weeks before she packed her things, drove them across town, and moved in with Mel Thompson. Boy meets girl on the AA campus. That's another saying they have in those meetings. I didn't cry when I saw her off. I didn't cry when I went back inside the little house with the great big mortgage either. The house where no baby had come, or now ever would. I just lay down on the bed that now belonged to me alone and put my arm over my eyes and mourned. Tearlessly. But I am not emotionally blocked. Christy was wrong about that. One day when I was 9, my mother met me at the door and I came home from school. She told me my collie, Rex, had been struck and killed by a truck that hadn't even bothered to stop. I didn't cry when we buried him, although my dad told me nobody would think less of me if I did. But I cried when she told me, partly because it was my first experience of death. Mostly because it had been my responsibility to make sure he was safely pinned up in our backyard. And I cried when Mom's doctor called me and told me what had happened that day on the beach. "I'm sorry, but there was no chance," he said. "Sometimes it's very sudden, and doctors tend to see that as a blessing." Christy wasn't there. She had to stay late at school that day and meet with a mother who had questions about her son's last report card. But I cried. All right. I went into our little laundry room and took a dirty sheet out of the basket and cried into that. Not for long, but tears came. I couldn't have told her about them later, but I didn't see the point. Partly because she would have thought I was pity fishing. That's not an AA term, but maybe it should be. And partly because I don't think the ability to bust out, falling pretty much on cue, should be a requirement for successful marriage. I never saw my dad cry at all, now that I think about it. At his most emotional, he might fetch a heavy sigh or grunt out a few reluctant chuckles, not breast beating or belly laughs of William Epping. He was the strong silent type, and for the most part my mother was the same. So maybe the not crying easily thing as genetic. But blocked, unable to feel my feelings. No, I have never been those things. Other than when I got the news about Mom, I can only remember one other time when I cried as an adult. And that was when I read the story of the janitor's father. I was sitting alone in the teacher's room at Lisbon High School, working my way through a stack of themes that my adult English class had written. Down the hall I could hear the thud of basketballs, the blare of the timeout horn, and the shouts of the crowd as the sports beast fought. Lisbon Greyhounds versus J Tigers. Who can know when life hangs in the balance or why? The subject I'd assigned was the day that changed my life. Most of the responses were heartfelt but awful. Sentimental tales of a kindly aunt who'd taken in a pregnant teenager, an army buddy who had demonstrated the true meaning of bravery, a chance meeting with a celebrity, Jeopardy, Hostile Extrabec, I think it was, but maybe it was Carl Malden. The teachers among you who have picked up an extra 3,000 or 4,000 a year by taking on a class of adults studying for the general equivalency diploma will know what a dispersing job reading such themes can be. The grading process hardly figures into it, or at least it didn't for me. I passed everybody because I never had an adult student who did less than try his or her ass off. If you turned in a paper with writing on it, you were guaranteed a hook from Jake Epping of the LHS English department, and if the writing was organized into actual paragraphs, you got at least a B-. What made the job hard was that red pen became my primary teaching tool instead of my mouth, and I practically wore it out. What made the job dispersing was that you knew that very little of that red pen teaching was apt to stick. If you reached the age of 25 or 30 without knowing how to spell totally, not totally, or capitalize in the proper places, White House, not White House, or write a sentence containing both a noun and a verb, you're probably never going to know. Yet we soldier on, gamely circling the misused word in a sentence like, my husband was too quick to judge me, or crossing out swam and replacing it with swam in the sentence I swam out to the float often after that. It was such hopeless, trudging work I was doing that night, while not far away another high school basketball game would down toward another final buzzer. World without end. Amen. It was not long after Christy got out of rehab, and I suppose if I was thinking anything, it was no hope that I'd come home and find her sober, which I did. She's held into her sobriety better than she held into her husband. I remember I had a little headache and was rubbing my temples the way you do when you're trying to keep a little nagger from turning into a big thumper. I remember thinking, 3 more of these, just 3, and I can get out of here. I can go home, fix myself a big cup of instant cacao, and dive into the new John Irving novel without these sincere but poorly made things hanging over my head.